Can a church survive when its leaders no longer speak the same theological language? This existential question pushed the Presbyterian Church to the brink of collapse. This friction reached its legal and spiritual turning point in a quiet 1924 manifesto that history records as the Auburn Affirmation. The early decades of the 20th century witnessed a profound tectonic shift within the broad landscape of American Protestantism across the nation. As the forces of industrialization, urbanization, and scientific advancement accelerated, ecclesiastical bodies grappled with an existential tension between historical orthodoxy and contemporary intellectual trends. Within this turbulent milieu, the Presbyterian Church in the USA became the primary battleground for a fierce ideological struggle regarding the nature of authority, truth, and identity. At the center of this ecclesial civil war stood the Auburn Affirmation, a document issued in early 1924 that fundamentally altered the trajectory of mainline Protestantism. Far from a mere localized administrative dispute, the Auburn Affirmation represented a sophisticated, coordinated attempt to redefine the boundaries of confessional adherence for ministers. By examining the catalyst that prompted this manifesto, this narrative explores the complex interplay of cultural anxiety, theological evolution, and constitutional maneuvering that defined the controversy. The immediate spark that ignited this ecclesiastical conflagration occurred in May 1922 when Harry Emerson Fosdick delivered a provocative sermon entitled, "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" Harry Emerson Fosdick sought to defend the validity of modern scientific and historical inquiry against what he strongly perceived as a rigid reactionary traditionalism within the church. In his rhetoric, Harry Emerson Fosdick characterized the conservatives as backward dogmatists refusing to engage with modern discoveries in history, science, and even comparative religion. By framing the controversy explicitly as an irreconcilable standoff between intellectual progress and stagnant obscurantism, Harry Emerson Fosdick established a lasting, highly polarizing theological binary. This dramatic rhetorical framing forced ministers and scholars across the entire denomination to choose a side, rapidly accelerating the deep polarization of the church's leadership. In response to the theological drift exemplified by Harry Emerson Fosdick, the conservative majority mobilized its voting strength at the 1923 General Assembly of the PCUSA. Seeking to reassert dogmatic boundaries, the Assembly reaffirmed the 1910 Portland Deliverance, mandating that candidates subscribe to scriptural inerrancy and the supernatural virgin birth of Christ. Candidates also had to affirm substitutionary atonement, the physical bodily resurrection, and the historical reality of miracles to satisfy the strict new legislative standards being enforced. By formalizing these 5 doctrines as immutable prerequisites for ordination, conservatives intended to establish an impenetrable firewall against the spread of alternative theological liberalism everywhere. They viewed these points as the foundational substrate of Christianity, without which the gospel would inevitably collapse into nothing more than secular humanitarianism across the world. This legislative victory created an immediate existential crisis, effectively criminalizing the nuanced metaphorical interpretations favored by modernist clergy who integrated evolutionary theory into their preaching. Ministers suddenly faced the real threat of heresy trials, defrocking, and expulsion, creating an urgent necessity for a unified strategy to challenge the Assembly's power. The conflict within the Presbyterian Church in the USA was anchored to a rigid, 5-point theological template that conservatives sought to make the absolute boundary of orthodoxy. Scriptural inerrancy dictated that the original biblical manuscripts were entirely free from error in all matters of human history, modern science, and traditional theology alike. The virgin birth was established by the Assembly as a non-negotiable benchmark for defining Christ's supernatural entry into the long course of human history itself. Substitutionary atonement mandated the belief that Christ offered himself as a literal sacrifice to fully satisfy divine justice and completely appease holy wrath for humanity. Bodily resurrection enforced the insistence that Jesus arose from the dead with the exact physical body in which he had previously suffered during the crucifixion. Historical miracles became the requirement that ministers confess Jesus performed miracles causing actual physical changes in nature without any reliance on natural explanations whatsoever. To the fundamentalist coalition, these doctrines were objective, supernatural facts. Modifying any single component was openly viewed as dismantling the integrity of the gospel itself entirely. While the theological debate garnered public attention, the authors of the Auburn Affirmation recognized that the weakest vulnerability in the conservative strategy lay strictly in ecclesiastical law. The General Assembly had repeatedly declared these 5 points essential, yet it had completely bypassed the Presbyterian denomination's mandatory legislative channels established by history. According to the church constitution, any binding doctrinal modification or expansion required a democratic process, the explicit approval of the General Assembly, followed by an affirmative vote from 2/3 of the individual presbyteries. By enacting the 5-point deliverance via a simple majority vote at an annual assembly, the conservative faction short-circuited this system. This constitutional breach became the foundational pillar of the Auburn Affirmation's legal argument. Beneath this debate over mechanics ran a struggle for political dominance and institutional control. The core question was jurisdiction. Did the centralized General Assembly possess the legal authority to intrude upon a local presbytery's historic right to examine and ordain its own ministerial candidates? In Presbyterian polity, the local presbytery is the foundational governing unit. Imposing a uniform, centralized doctrinal test effectively stripped these local bodies of their traditional autonomy. This overreach proved to be a major tactical error. A vast contingent of moderate churchmen, though personally conservative in their own theology, possessed a profound devotion to historic Presbyterian procedure. When forced to choose, these moderates chose the Constitution over a theological agenda, resisting a centralized assembly that rode roughshod over established church law. The core intellectual machinery of the Auburn Affirmation relied on a distinction between the great facts and doctrines of the Christian faith and the certain theories utilized to interpret them. The authors did not reject the 5 core doctrines listed by the General Assembly. Instead, they opposed transforming one specific explanation of those doctrines into a compulsory test for ordination. All who hold to these facts and doctrines, whatever theories they may employ to explain them, are worthy of all confidence and fellowship, the manifesto boldly declared. For instance, they argued that while Christ's atonement is an indispensable biblical truth, the theory of substitutionary satisfaction is ultimately merely one valid and available theological model. This clever rhetorical maneuver allowed signers to maintain historical orthodoxy while simultaneously stripping the fundamentalist platform of its claim to absolute and absolute authority over the church. The document introduced concepts that challenged traditional confessional structures, asserting that the church should refrain from establishing rigid, centralized dogma resembling the Roman Catholic Church completely. This centralized enforcement was a practice the authors viewed as entirely contrary to the true spirit of the Reformation and the liberties historically claimed by Protestant ministers. Furthermore, the document targeted absolute biblical inerrancy, pointing out that the Bible nowhere declares itself free from minor historical or elementary scientific errors in its text. By decoupling scriptural authority from literal inerrancy, the Auburn Affirmation sought to carve out a protected space for modern scientific inquiry and historical criticism within the ministry. To justify this intellectual latitude, the Auburn Affirmation anchored its argument firmly in American Presbyterian history and the venerable Westminster Confession of Faith itself. The manifesto opened by affirming the Westminster Confession, but immediately balanced this traditional submission with an uncompromising appeal to the historic principle of Christian liberty. They noted that the confession explicitly disclaims its own infallibility and condemns forced submission to ecclesiastical authority by any simple majority vote of the assembly. The Affirmationists argued that doctrinal diversity was an intrinsic characteristic of American Presbyterianism, preserving true unity through a shared commitment to Christ rather than enforced uniformity. The Affirmationists argued that tying the gospel's spiritual authority to the absolute factual perfection of ancient texts was both textually untenable and theologically dangerous for modern believers. However, the masterstroke of the Auburn Affirmation was refusing to get dragged into abstract theological nuances that could easily divide its own growing coalition of supporters. By shifting the battleground from what a minister must believe to how the church must legally govern itself, the writers built an inclusive platform uniting progressives, liberals, and procedural moderates. By the winter of 1923, the revised document was ready for its public debut before the leaders of the Presbyterian Church in the USA. In January 1924, the manifesto was formally published under its enduring title, bearing the signatures of an initial cohort of 150 prominent Presbyterian clergy everywhere. This original group of initial signatories was deliberately selected to project an unmistakable image of intellectual gravity and unwavering institutional fidelity to the church constitution. These were not radical outsiders. They were pastors of major urban pulpits, respected educators, and highly regarded denominational leaders throughout the entire Presbyterian network. The January publication served as a trial balloon signaling to the wider church that a structured, legally grounded resistance was officially underway against the Assembly's mandate. The newly published document successfully provided a rallying point for ministers who had previously felt completely isolated by the sudden and sweeping conservative victory at the Assembly. To transform this regional statement into a representative nationwide movement, Robert Hastings Nichols partnered with Henry Sloane Coffin, the influential pastor of Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church. Henry Sloane Coffin possessed the expansive social and ecclesiastical networks necessary to distribute the Auburn Affirmation broadly across the entire territory of the United States at that time. The success of this strategy became undeniable when the document was reissued in May 1924, just prior to the next General Assembly, bearing the names of 1,274 ministers. Securing signatures from approximately 20% of all ordained Presbyterian ministers in the country was a remarkable feat that stunned the conservative assembly leaders completely. Demographic analysis reveals that while many signatories were centered in New York, the vast majority shared educational roots at Auburn, Union, or McCormick theological seminaries. This shared background provided the common intellectual framework that united a fifth of the denomination's clergy behind a single paradigm-shifting manifesto against centralized church power. At its most fundamental level, the Auburn Affirmation put forward a distinct vision for the church, asserting that the PCUSA was and always had been an inherently diverse institution. The authors flatly rejected the fundamentalist conviction that theological variation was synonymous with heresy or unorthodoxy, arguing a healthy degree of diversity was a defining Presbyterian characteristic. To protect this institutional character, the Affirmation stood firmly against elevating the 5 stated doctrines to the level of mandatory tests for ordination or retaining good standing. The signatories sought to reclaim the historic policy of accepting differences, choosing instead to subordinate those differences to a shared loyalty to Jesus Christ and the gospel. They chose to subordinate differences to a unified commitment to the kingdom of God, reasserting a shared spiritual mission over any enforced uniformity of thought. To defend this position, they explicitly cited the traditional reluctance of Presbyterianism to grant any single assembly the right of absolute interpretation over the confession or scriptures. The publication of the Affirmation brought the PCUSA to a dramatic crossroads, as 2 massive, highly motivated segments of the denomination held completely incompatible views on authority. The looming question that dominated the 1920s was whether the Presbyterian Church would inevitably split along these ideological lines, or if it could discover a new mechanism. A formal division was successfully averted because a massive, quiet middle block of the denomination refused to align with either extreme, holding the true balance of power. By prioritizing corporate unity and institutional stability over doctrinal perfection, this moderate majority allowed the spirit of the Auburn Affirmation to take root, changing their collective identity. By mid-1924, the publication of the Auburn Affirmation had successfully drawn a line in the ecclesiastical sand by leveraging clever legal arguments regarding Presbyterian autonomy. By introducing the flexible facts versus theories framework, a determined minority of progressive clergy managed to unite a massive, silent middle block of moderates under a single banner. They had effectively built an institutional shield to protect theological diversity and stall the fundamentalist momentum, safeguarding their positions against immediate centralized actions across the denomination. However, the conservative faction had no intention of retreating quietly. The fundamentalist majority was highly organized, deeply convicted, and about to unleash a devastating intellectual counter-strategy. This aggressive and highly coordinated fundamentalist counterattack would permanently shatter the peace of the denomination, leaving an indelible mark on the entire structure of the church. Join us tomorrow for part 2, the Auburn Affirmation, J. Gresham Machen, and the Great Presbyterian Fracture, where we explore the explosive conservative counterattack led by J. Gresham Machen, the dramatic institutional trials, and the long-term fallout that followed.